Through. No, good evening, everybody. I had mic turned off, so it just looked like I was sitting there looking at a camera and then looking away from the camera at something else. So we're going to continue. This is the Got Ancient Wisdom live stream, as I said, into the silence. So we're going to continue reading Stan Gooch's first book, Total Man. We're on chapter 13 this week, which is the Psychotic Society. So I don't think anything fun or exciting has gone on this week, really, to do with our subject. Everything is to do with our subject. So we could examine quite a lot of events or situations from the point of view of Gooch's work, every event and every situation, because it all involves humans, unless we're talking about something completely out of the sphere of human experience, like I don't know, whales at sea, or the formation of clouds or something like that. But we're not talking about those things. We are humans, so we're talking about human stuff. Let me just move a window or two around so I can see things a bit better, because I'm struggling to see things like chat windows and all the rest of it. So the only way out is in, and Ralph Hexham in the chat already. It's heating up in there. Yeah, when the only way out is in the chat said got sound off, be with you in a bit. I thought they're talking about me, but the sound is on now, so they weren't talking about me. So unless any of you have got anything interesting to mention, then we'll just carry on with chapter 13, which is the Psychotic Society. And if you are tuning in and wondering what we're doing, we're just reading through a book. That's all we're doing. It's a book that not many people know about. It's called Total Man by an author called Stan Gooch. And this channel is dedicated to highlighting Stan Gooch's work. And so we're going to start with Total Man, and we're going to slowly work our way through all of his books. So this was written in 1972. So some of the language is going to be a bit out of date, but that's all right. You're all okay with non-politically correct language, I'm sure. You're all grown up. But also in this chapter, there's going to be some stuff about the Second World War and things like that. That obviously facts have changed a little bit. A little bit more is known about the events, and but you'll get the general gist of it. You know, the general gist being that this is how, you know, this Psychotic Society is in response to R.D. Lang's Neurotic Society at the time, which Stan covers that anyway. So we're going to start. We've got Trevon right in the chat. Hello, Trevon. So we're going to start with some quotes. So the first one is from Rollo May, quoted by Alexander Lowin in The Betrayal of the Body. So this is chapter 13 of Total Man, the Psychotic Society. Many psychotherapists have pointed out that more and more patients exhibit schizoid features, and the typical kind of psychic problem in our day is not hysteria, as it was in Freud's time, but the schizoid type. That is to say, the problem of persons who are detached, unrelated, lacking in affect, tending towards depersonalization, and covering up their problems by means of intellectualization and technical formulations. There is also plenty of evidence that the sense of isolation, the alienation of one's self from the world, is suffered not only by people in pathological conditions, but by countless normal persons as well in our day. And this next quote is from John Davey, The Evolution of Evolution, which was in an Observer colour supplement on the 8th of February 1970. Most people ask themselves at one time or another, what is the meaning of life? A great many presumably conclude that they don't know for certain, but they manage to live with their uncertainty. It seems, though, that this uncertainty may be contributing to a spreading modern illness. A psychiatrist from the University of Vienna, Professor Viktor Frankl, says there is a worldwide phenomenon which represents a major challenge to psychiatry. He calls it the existential vacuum, and claims that growing numbers of patients are crowding clinics and consulting rooms, complaining not of classical neurosis, but of a sense of total meaninglessness in their lives. Other psychologists have encountered the same phenomenon, and it seems that 1/5 of all neuroses may now be of this kind. And now we have a quote from Henry Miller in an article in Penthouse magazine, volume 4, number 7, 1969. Or take the news commentator himself and his manner of reporting the varied happenings of the day. Does he ever break down with grief? Does he ever become paralyzed by the horror and gravity of his reports? He goes from horrendous, nauseating, shocking incidents to the trivia of everyday life with scarcely a change of intonation in his voice. He avoids comments of his own, even though the news is shattering. He likens himself as much as possible to a machine, a tape recorder, a ticker tape. So I think you'll get the gist of where this chapter is going to be going. These are so this is from the book now. These are three faces of what we shall call the Psychotic Society. No doubt the words of these extracts will recall both the tone and content of R.D. Laing's views on the nature of psychosis reported in Chapter 5. What then is the Psychotic Society? Firstly, I must emphasise that the term as such is of my own coinage. It is not, as far as I'm aware, used by other writers. What, however, is common is the phrase the Neurotic Society, an inaccurate phrase, I suggest, used to cover some of the phenomena which will be under discussion. As is hopefully clear, I have very profound objections to the interchangeable use of the term neurotic and psychotic at any level. Most importantly, the words psychotic and neurotic, as used in this chapter, will not carry their full clinical meanings. Whenever I wish to indicate the diagnosed, hospitalized mental illness to which these labels usually refer, I shall expressly speak of clinical neurosis and clinical psychosis. The difference between the term psychosis, as used here, and clinical psychosis, and between the term neurosis and clinical neurosis, should nevertheless be understood to be principally one of degree, not one of kind. Neurotic and psychotic refers to the psychological social conditions or preconditions out of which or within which the full-fledged clinical condition can readily develop. These may be visualized then as a continuum, or rather two continua, at one end of which is a condition or state acceptable and accepted as normality, and at the other end the neurotic or psychotic breakdown respectively. Thus, when this chapter speaks of the Psychotic Society, it does not quite mean the insane society. It does mean, however, the society which has moved and is moving perceptibly further along the upward growth curve to that condition. The styles of the neurotic versus the Psychotic Society may be considered, in the first instance, historically. My proposal is that the societies of earlier times were in the main neurotic, while our latter-day societies of the 20th century is psychotic. Let it be emphasized for the last time that neurotic here does not mean clinically neurotic. It does not mean neurotically incapacitated, except in the senses subsequently defined. As instances of neurotic societies, let us consider those of historical South America. That of the Aztecs, for example. The life of the Aztecs was entirely governed by religion and religious considerations. The temporal ruler, as in Egypt, was at the same time the spiritual ruler, himself a divinity or semi-divinity. The economy of the country, again, as in Egypt, was essentially geared not to the production of consumer goods, but to the production of vast monuments to the gods or God. pyramids, tombs, temples of expansive and expensive design. So any citizen might at any point find himself nominated for human sacrifice, say thrown down a well to solicit rain. In this, the society acquiesced, not necessarily cheerfully, but by and large unprotestingly. But we, looking back in time, are horrified at society, which regularly and without pity arbitrarily sacrifices and tortures numbers of its citizens to placate the vagaries of climate or the imagined wrath of a mythical god. We have little hesitation in describing such a society as irrational, even perhaps insane. An Aztec Indian, however, could he be brought forward in time and shown the present state of Lake Erie, would have for his part also no doubt that our present society is insane. Lake Erie is one of the Great Lakes, the fourth largest, on the border of United States and Canada. It has a surface area of 10,000 square miles. This lake can no longer support organic life. The statement has been made twice because we are often in the habit of reading statements without becoming aware of their content. In common with many other aspects of our natural environment, the pollution of this lake by industrial effluent has been a cause of concern to a very few individuals for some time. The end process has now apparently been reached. In a recent television documentary, biologists and others confirmed that the condition of Lake Erie is now irreversible. It not only does not support life, but it cannot be made to do so. It is now a chemical soup to which it is possible only to add further chemicals. The effect of this would be, as it were, to change the flavour without making it more edible. To repeat our earlier comment, the Aztec Indian would be quite clear in his mind that we are insane. We are destroying, in his view, the very basis of life, the very context in which life, meaningful or otherwise, exists. The proposed concept of the neurotic and psychotic societies may be further considered from the standpoint of the development of the individual human being. The maximum incidence of clinical psychosis in terms of admission to hospitals, as stated elsewhere, is between the ages of 20 to 24 for men and 30 to 34 for women. Thus, clinical psychosis may, with some justification, be considered to be an illness primarily of the adult organism. Optimal age at admission to hospital in respect of clinical neurosis is a rather harder statistic to come by in the literature. One must be content with the implications of the generally agreed tendency, generally agreed amongst psychologists, not psychoanalysts, for individuals to grow out of neurosis even without treatment as they get older. Thus, people, in general, seem to grow out of neurosis as children into psychosis as adults. In the non-clinical sense of this chapter, it is legitimate to consider all children and youngsters as neurotic. In early childhood, they believe in magic, dream more than adults, are terrified of physical isolation, and so on. As adolescents, they are often deeply religious, believe in love, read and write poetry, and so forth. To what extent adults, on the other hand, may be considered naturally psychotic is precisely the nub of our present discussion. These general considerations appear nevertheless to fit conceptually rather well with the notion that early or primitive societies are neurotic and recent, more evolved societies psychotic in this sense. Early communities were youngsters, present-day society is grown-up. Unfortunately, this description is a little too simple. It is, moreover, by implication unnecessarily derogatory to early societies and certainly too flattering to those of the 20th century. The position is rather as follows. First, although one takes the constitutional predisposition of the individual, his inherited tendency to be either a system A or system B dominant, to be the overriding factor, nevertheless, particularly where the inherited predisposition is not of a marked nature, a taught way of life and or a given type of society together undoubtedly exercise some shaping and disposing influences. So he's saying that although the predisposition of the individual, whether they're more system A or more system B dominant, so what Stan's saying is that people are system A or system B dominant. They'll have a system A or system B, therefore in the recessive place as well, and that. And particularly where it's not totally obvious what system they are that is dominant, that society has a way of shaping and correcting, or temporarily correcting anyway, some of the natural predisposition in people, but not all, And what I'd add that maybe might make it more simple to understand is that society, rather than molding you into something, actually molds you out of something. So you are born in a naturally either system A or system B dominant, and society sort of overlays behaviors and actions on top of it, which then cause you to become anxious if you are forced out of behaving in a way that is natural to you. And then so that can then lead to problems further down the line, which is where you get people on drugs or whatever for all sorts of things, because the society itself is no longer geared towards the natural state of who you are, but it's instead trying to mold you. So whereas they would see it as you're a blank slate that is able to be programmed from birth, the way I would see it, and the way that I know Stan saw it, is that you are born with a personality that is going to lead you in a certain direction, and that society then overlays itself on top of that. So that prevents you being your natural self. Back to the book. Thus, when System B functions are encouraged during the course of the individual's development to the detriment or with the neglect of System A functions, an adult, and hence a society, will tend to be produced biased in favour of System B. When System A is encouraged during the individual's development, a more System A biased adult and way of life tend to be the outcome. Now, as it further happens, the child is naturally predisposed to be swayed by and towards System B, while the adult is naturally predisposed to react in the same way towards System A and System A situations. Therefore, it tends somewhat to follow in the context of these predispositions that the effect of a conditioning or an environment favouring System A will not show up until later in life, because during youth those influences are to some extent counterbalanced or counteracted by the natural ontogenetic resistance of the organism at this time. This account would, amongst other things, accommodate the relatively low incidence of childhood psychosis. This can and does occur, however, if the attack on System B is consistent enough or the child is in some other way predisposed. So that's what he would say that the rise in autism is due to. And also gender dysmorphia, which is another form of psychosis, I guess. Unlike the effect of System A training, the effect of System B training shows up as a rule during early life. The predisposing conditions being then most favourable. Theoretically, the effects could be expected to diminish in later life. And in actuality, it seems that the neurotic does sometimes grow out of his neurosis. Speaking with some caution, since, as indicated, evolutionary and genetic considerations are also heavily involved, whose precise influence is extremely difficult to assess, one can suggest that one reason why primitive peoples have neurotic societies is because they have not been subjected to extreme, or indeed any at all to speak of, System A conditioning and training. A sample of children drawn from such a community, however, could no doubt be experimentally galvanized into something much closer to the Psychotic Society. This, in fact, we appear to observe to an extent in certain primitive peoples brought into large-scale contact with the 20th century. Conversely, one suggests that we ourselves tend to encourage a System A society by the way we treat our children, i.e., intellectually and mechanically. Be these considerations as they may, the fact of our present psychotic society are writ large in all forms of public media and public institutions and many aspects of the nature of Western society, so large in fact that we tend even not to perceive them without some initial direction. Lake Erie is an example. This event is on such a scale that a genuine effort is required to appreciate its significance. To grasp that significance, it is necessary first to build up in the imagination the industrial background, the nature of the social organisation, the chains of circumstance, and the whole infrastructure of events which must pre-exist before that event could exist, which, as it were, give birth to that event. Once one begins to make this effort of imagination, then one begins to appreciate the otherwise decontexted, out of focus event under discussion for what it is, the open sore on a diseased body. These are fine phrases if they mean anything, since it is not only difficult to imagine that they do, but leads to so unpleasant a conclusion that one would rather do almost anything than admit the implications of the kind of events described. The present book offers here only one of a giant symptom of the deviant psyche of society. The following extract is taken from the London Evening Standard, 8th of October 1969. Montreal, Wednesday. 3 people were shot dead as a night of violence gripped Montreal when 4,000 policemen walked out in a pay dispute. Mobs rampaged down the city's main street, smashing door windows and looting. During the night, fires, explosions, assaults, robberies, and a full-pitched gun battle kept most Montrealers huddled in their homes in what was described as the worst reign of terror in the city's history. The mob spread down the main street, smashing shop windows and looting. At one point, they broke open a firearms store, hauling away rifles and other weapons in their cars. And so the article continues. What is one to say about this story? How is it that this one item of news does not bring every one of us to a halt in our tracks with the realization that something has gone unbelievably wrong with the 20th century? Deliberately, I have chosen not to use any of the myriad items of a similar nature which emerge almost daily from the United States, from gangster-ridden, materialistic New York or Chicago. Instead, the item we have offered comes from former British Empire, almost lovable Canada. With this, we adjust our lens focus. The items which now follow attempt to turn the phrase "the Psychotic Society" from a not uninteresting but perhaps nevertheless fundamentally conversation piece concept into a literal reality. There are several points to bear in mind. The first is our earlier proposal that clinical psychosis and clinical neurosis do not differ from everyday behaviour so much in kind as merely in degree. Second, that the word normal does not at all mean correct or good, but simply that which approximates to the norm. One asks 2 questions. A, whether the present norm, the normality of Western society, approximates more closely to the norms of clinical psychosis than it does to the norms of clinical neurosis. And B, whether that norm is in any case not static, but is noticeably moving in the direction of the extreme condition of full clinical psychosis. The items following may seem an extremely slight platform on which to mount the rather grave charges we are preferring. Indeed, these are deliberately arranged in order of triviality. Moreover, one does not seek to deny the perfectly rational basis of some of them. One asks only whether the apparent rationality does not rather contain the seeds of rationalization. And that is rationalization as a psychiatric term. So then we have, hang on, let me find my list. Jesus, this mouse isn't working very well. Okay. So the symptoms of our alleged patient society are these. 1. The covering of domestic gardens with concrete to make a parking space for one's car. 2. The replacement of telephone exchange and postal district names with numbers and the numbering of personal bank accounts. 3. The protective pre-wrapping of foodstuffs and the sterilisation of milk for longer life, an interesting paradox. 4. The fear which, for instance, many Americans going abroad have of catching a disease, as evidenced by long programs of shots prior to leaving. That's now. All of this is now, by the way. The high production rate and over-diversification of detergents, cleaning, cleansing, and cosmetic products of all kinds. 6. The overproduction of motor cars and consumer durables of all kinds and their triumph in importance, in many senses, over the human being. This is all now. This was written in 1972, based on, obviously, all the other work that's come before this. So this is, he's obviously doing a little bit of future predicting. 7. The city as a desert. And by desert, we mean a desolate and barren region or a place where nothing grows. 8. The actions and reactions both of the British Labour government and still more of the Conservatives towards permissiveness, pornography and marijuana. 0 is the reactions that both of those people have. 9. The marked increase in the use of technical and jargon terms based on Latin roots in everyday speech. Now, this one is true. There has been an increase in the use of technical and jargon terms based on Latin roots in everyday speech, but the one that he didn't see was the use of gobbledygook words more and more. So the joining together of just nonsense words to make new words, and then the use of gobbledygook words to describe whole things like Google. 10. The building of very high, square, transparent blocks of offices and flats using non-organic materials, in respect of which the present book would like to coin the phrase the anti-womb. One of the aims of these buildings appeared to be to get as far away from the earth as possible. 11. The denial of spontaneity and emotion at large by the institution of procedure, protocol, precedent, tradition, formalization, and the pre-recording of radio and television broadcasts, and so on, and the general substitution of content by form, function by office. 12. The shallowness of registered and expressed emotion, the inconsequentiality and triviality, as described by Henry Miller, of everyday life in the West. Emoticons is a good example of this very thing, the shallowness of registered and expressed emotion. We've got a whole bunch of little icons that do that exact thing. 13. The trivialization on the one hand of women as women, and on the other, and on the other, the masculinization of women. So what do you say about that one? The trivialization on the one hand of women as women, and on the other, the masculinization of women. 14. The techniques of many kinds of killing at a distance, in the most extreme forms of which the people killed are seen by the killer neither before nor after that event. The drone strikes, anyone? 15. Allied to this, the application of industrial techniques to the killing and disposal of human beings, as particularly in Nazi Germany, but also in the guillotine, the electric chair, and so on, making feasible the notion and possible the phenomenon of mass destruction, the countercoin to mass production. I think that's probably something you want to talk to the VAT people about. 16. The removal of feeling and emotion, morality and ethics from the study of psychology. the replacement of a human-centered or even an organism-centered study of life by quantified, mechanistic and reductionist methods and computer-based models. So what have we seen with COVID? We've just seen computer-based models telling us how to live our lives. The only way out is in the chat. They're all things I've called anti-nature since I was about 10, lol. Yes, exactly. This mouse ain't working. Is this collection wholly nonsensical? Or have we in it some hope of justifying what has been claimed? It is not impossible to establish links between these behaviours of so-called normal society and the behaviours of hospitalised psychotics, and this linking is now undertaken. It will, of course, be appreciated before we move on that the list above does not by any means exhaust the dossier of possible charges against the full complement of symptoms shown by the Psychotic Society. One has, for instance, not even mentioned the education system, the devourer of souls. Let it be emphasised once again that one is fully prepared to acknowledge the role of reality, meaning here non-psychotic factors, which have in all cases contributed to the position. For example, one is aware that the switching from telephone exchange names to all-figure telephone numbers is part of a programme of rationalisation, dictated by, e.g., the wish to provide a worldwide direct dialing system, whereby any person can ultimately dial any other person in any part of the world without the services of an operator. In hospitals up and down England, there are psychotics who spend all their time attempting to stay clean. Prior to breakdown and admission to hospital, they may be taking as many as 6 baths a day with as many changes of clothes, particularly of underwear. In latter stages of the illness, these people move on to endless cycles through the house, washing doorknobs, scrubbing already spotless floors, the insides of dustbins, flushing the lavatory repeatedly on passing the lavatory door. In this connection, we are reminded perhaps particularly of Joey, who thought the whole world a sea of excrement into which he would be dragged down. A question the reader might like to consider is how many times a person would have to change his shirt every day before we would begin to consider him mad. 25 times, 15 times, 8 times, 4 times, twice? Of course, these matters cannot simply be approached numerically. A further parameter is that of compulsion. An individual may like to change his shirt 2 or even 3 times a day, but he does not necessarily feel that he has to. He may do it when convenient, but when it is not so, say when travelling, he may shrug and dismiss the matter from his mind. It is the degree of uneasiness which the person demonstrates when prevented from acting in his chosen manner, from carrying out his normal routine, which is one of the more important clues. What then does one make of a whole nation or class preoccupied with cleanliness? One thinks here particularly of Americans who boil water before they drink it in England, who, in some cases, boil the water they wash in, and who feel physically unable to drink water that has not been boiled. Compare here the hippie practice of passing a joint from mouth to mouth amongst strangers, let alone friends. Health is a logical extension of cleanliness. Some people take vitamin tablets and similar preparations daily. Others go through a program of exercises when they get up or before they go to bed. Such practices are within the range of the normal. Once again, however, one must consider also, along with incidents, the degree of compulsion. Prior to actual psychotic breakdown, some individuals are taking 6, 10, 12 kinds of medicine daily, running 20 miles an evening, refusing all food except, say, boiled spinach, and are unable to tolerate being in a room unless a window is open. Both of the matters just considered, cleanliness and health, are closely linked to ritualism. Obsessional psychotics perform many long, apparently meaningless rituals. They may walk up and down endlessly alongside one wall of a room, or sit making interminable ritual movements of the hands, the head, or the whole body, or perhaps make and unmake a bed over and over again. The ritual in these cases is an end in itself, and the content is non-existent, at least to the observer, or immaterial. An extremely interesting feature here is seen in the results of interference with the ritual by another person. When this occurs, the patient, who till then has been relatively calm and certainly controlled, who will at that point exhibit an outburst of uncontrollable anger, become completely hysterical, break down and weep abjectly or whatever. It is clear that the ritual has been exercising a strong containing or controlling influence. We've got a question from Trevorn. Have we? Is Stan Gooch in his predictions? Got ancient wisdom. Is Stan Gooch in his predictions think that the probability of society and social beings creating challenges to stop extinction? Creating challenges to stop extinction. What, to stop their own extinction? They're creating their own challenges. That's actually, you know what? You're probably not far off of it, actually, is that there is some kind of, it's maybe on a personal level, the extinction. So it might be that people feel that they may personally be extinct, and so they're giving themselves challenges to stop them. But it's probably to stop them thinking about it. And that's when you end up with, like the Patrick Moore, the guy from Greenpeace, was saying that the environmentalists are basically a death cult because they are obsessed with death, and instead of facing up to their own death, they then put it onto the planet. Oh, the planet's going to die. Oh, one day the planet will die and you'll all be responsible for it, and you have to do this, and you're a sinner, and blah blah blah. So I suppose in that way, yeah, that these people, psychotics are trying to escape death. Or their own extinction or annihilation, and so they create these challenges to stop them thinking about it, if that's what you mean. The relevant question to ask of the Psychotic Society is, at what point can needful or productive procedure, protocol and method be said to become ritual? Again, the beginnings of an answer would be sought in terms of frequency and compulsion. The writer suggests that the sheer bulk of protocol in Western society is alone already suspect. Could one really justify all of it? Does one not hear it commonly said that protocol holds up rather than facilitates progress? The pursuits of bureaucracy and procedure appear to have become self-justifying ends in themselves. The present writer is himself particularly concerned over the paramount importance which method and methodology have assumed in modern psychology. In this field of inquiry, which is closest to the personal experience we term life, whose very subject matter is, or should be, that experience, we find the strongest emphasis on a practice, the experimental method, which undeniably, and I suggest intentionally, interposes itself between the psychologist and his subject. The question really is whether the experimental method functions as a necessary filter, selector or rangefinder, as is claimed, or as a shield, defence, or capital D, denial. Allied to the objectification of the social sciences and the technicalization of their private terminology is the objectification of public language. So a man who works with his hands, a hand worker, is a manual operative, which actually means precisely the same, deriving from Latin manus, hand, and opus, work. Similarly, a dustman is a refuse disposal operative. One may instantly multiply one's examples by opening any newspaper or magazine. Of far greater significance, however, is the escalation. Here, in the military context, one finds oneself automatically using escalation in preference to the Anglo-Saxon growth or build-up of this same practice in connection with warfare. Even the word warfare itself begins to have an archaic ring. The as common, becoming more common term is combat, from Latin combatur, to strike with. With this change of terminology, the whole affect, the meaning in that sense, is lost. Thus, in a successful medium-range airstrike, the Allied command today liquidated heavy concentrations of enemy forces in the Dortmund area. What this actually means in real terms is something like as follows. Quite a lot of human beings from one group sitting in machines went over to another group of human beings where, using the machines, that first group blinded, smashed the chests of, and tore the limbs from a great many of the second group, only some of whom were soldiers. When the first group came away, everywhere in that place, men, surrounded by parts of men, lay screaming and dying. Some with eyes oozing from their skulls, others with flies clustered on their exposed, bleeding parts or on intestines, strung out sometimes yards from their stomachs. In other places away from that place, though they did not as yet know it, large numbers of children, indistinguishable except in terms of language and a few psychological attitudes from the children of the men of the first group, and not the children who lay their eyes similarly oozing, etc., amongst the dead and dying men, were now without fathers. Many wives came to face the desert, the empty night of the rest of their lives without their husbands. One need not pursue these points. Suffice to say that the device of Latinization, objectification, and jargonizing of language resembles closely the complex intellectualizations, and in particular the intellectual denial of emotion seen in many psychotics. Joey offered one striking instance of this. Yeah, so the invention of new words to that reminds us of the schizophrenies from earlier on in the book. That schizophrenics will join together words that hint at where the issue lies, but they're not aware they're doing it. So you get a lot of this going on with the portmanteau words, where people join together words to make new descriptive words, or something like emoticon, emotional icon. A common and clinically widely accepted category of psychosis is that of paranoia. In paranoia, the patient feels either mildly or desperately, diffusely or specifically persecuted. The patient may, fairly specifically, imagine that people are talking about him, that the government is spying on him, that an assassin has been hired to kill him, or he may find certain aspects of the environment, such as dirt or the presence of certain objects, unbearable. He may remain calm and relatively normal until, say, a cat is brought into the room, or he may tolerate the presence of visitors, even of strangers. But if anyone touches him, he may become insane with rage or fear. Or he may selectively be able to tolerate men, but not women, and the discussion of some topics, but not others, perhaps again the discussion of sex or body functions. Surely the attitudes of Western governments, the establishment, to permissiveness, that is, to casual or frequent sex, daring, or way out styles of dress or hairstyles and so on, pornography and marijuana, resemble those of paranoia. They do so in two ways. First, in the selective nature of this response. Second, in the exaggerated nature of the response in terms of the objective realities of what is objected to. Let it be at once clear that I am not saying that we as yet know sufficient about the effects of, say, marijuana to give it an unqualified clearance certificate. The establishment can, for example, and quite rightly does, point to the fact that the increase in pot smoking in the United States has been accompanied by a rise in the consumption of heroin and other hard drugs. Yeah, so Ralph Hexham in the chat says hate crime, just throwing out a newspeak term not aimed at anyone. Right, there you go. Hate crime. Because in another sense, hate crime would be that you're against crime, wouldn't it? You hate crime. You're somebody who's tough on crime. But in newspeak, no. So it's a proto word, because they even put a line between it. The same with the word anti-Semitism. If you notice over the last maybe 2 years, they've turned it from a proto word with a little dash in between it, and now they've turned it into an actual word with no dash. So it's just one word, which doesn't make any sense, because the S should be capitalized because it's about a group. You'd think that you'd have to have that S. The S would remain capitalized to emphasize the the importance of that particular group, but people see it as a symbol now. They see the word as a symbol, and so you recognize the word for what it is. You don't recognize the two words separately, so it becomes a new nonsense word. Ralph, the only way out is in. It says anti-Semitic, and then Ralph Hexam says anti-vaxxer will be one word next. Yeah, that's true. Anti-vaxxer. One is on less controversial ground in respect of permissiveness, sex, and pornography. Is there any evidence, for example, to show that a man works less efficiently in shorts and shirt sleeves, particularly on a hot day, than he works when wearing a suit? Yet lawyers, for instance, are not allowed to appear in court in shirt sleeves. In the night, that is quite weird, yeah. In the 1920s of the present century, many women set out to look more like men. Hair was cropped short, breasts flattened, smoking became commonplace. While there was indignation in some quarters over this phenomenon, there was never any suggestion of any kind of legislation to prevent those aspects of women's activities. Indeed, this would have been seen as wholly absurd, an unforgivable and ridiculous intrusion into the private affairs of the individual. In the last decade or so in our society, there has evolved a fashion movement which involves men coming to look more like women. Men grow their hair long, wear silks and bright colours, and cease such masculine activities as consuming large quantities of alcohol. One has the definite impression that the conservative establishment in particular would very much like to legislate against this trend. Wow, how things have changed. One has the definite impression that the conservative establishment in particular would very much like to legislate against this trend, albeit somewhat indirectly, by, for example, reintroducing conscription, reducing national assistance benefits, expelling from school pupils with long hair, and so on. If this is the case, it would seem that the establishment is more threatened by the conversion of men to women than it was by the conversion of women to men. Right, so back in the 70s then, there was a definite resistance to the conversion of men to women. And the conservatives, so if you're a young person, I'm 46, so I'm not really young, but if you're a young person and you just thought this was just like an endless march towards madness, you can see from this that at least in the 1970s, there was the feeling that the conservatives were against the Conservative Party. It says, that the conservative establishment, but it is a small c. So, yeah, it's this. They're saying I suppose what he's saying is the establishment that was more conservative at the time would be legislating against the trend for men to become like women. Not like now. The paranoia is seen at its clearest in connection with sexual activity as such. Here, the authorities, without appearing too ridiculous, can and do legislate. Obviously, the risk of appearing ridiculous is preferable to the risk of seeing nude bodies. In an earlier chapter, it was proposed that sex in Western society is an underground institution. The extent to which this is true emerges only when a comparison is made with an open institution, such as aggression. On any given day, it is possible, without difficulty and with full public knowledge, to see a display in which two men hit each other. There are no such displays of lovemaking. Latterly, but only latterly, and it is this about which the government is so concerned, adults may see pictorial representations or pseudo-representations of this act. Pictorial displays of violence, on the other hand, are, of course, freely available to children of all ages and both sexes at every cinema and on every television screen. And I'll add on every computer game. From our cultural history emerge, with the possible exception of Rudolph Valentino, no heroes who were great lovers and nothing else. In the history of the whole of Western Europe, only two names come to mind, Don Juan and Casanova. Even so, the reputation of these men is only at best a somewhat tarnished one, and even so, none of the three names mentioned, one observes, is Anglo-Saxon. We have, on the other hand, many cultural heroes who were fighters. Both in this country and America, there exists also some extremely exclusive institutions where over a period of several years one may study the history and practice of murder with a view to becoming a qualified murderer oneself. There are no such institutions where one may study lovemaking. If in this country a man walks up to a small girl, aged say 8, and places his hand on her chest, several things will happen. He will lose his job, go to prison, and in prison be wholly rejected by the other inmates, unlike a murderer, and instead be physically beaten and tormented by them. If, however, this same man had struck the said child in the face, he would perhaps have lost his job, depending partly on whether the child's father was content to hit him several times, or whether the father brought a legal charge of assault. The man would in any case not go to prison, but be fined or bound over to keep the peace. One is, of course, aware that the first act of the man placing his hand on the girl's chest might well have been the prelude to sexually assaulting and subsequently murdering the child. What we are concerned with, however, the extremes of public reaction to this admittedly horrible possibility, let alone the act. It would be an equally horrible act to kill another man with a bayonet, or so one would think. When one leaves a public lavatory in this country, there are prominent signs with the instruction, "Please adjust your dress before leaving," and "Now wash your hands." At the exit to a munitions factory, there should be the notice, "Now..." At the exit to a munitions factory, there should be the notice, "Now please cut off your hands." There is, of course, no such instruction. In our culture, fuck, bugger, cunt and prick, and shit, piss, fart and turd are swear words. Kill, maim, mutilate, beat, stab, hurt, destroy are not. In other words, obscenity resides wholly in the sexual act and the acts of excretion, not in the act of killing. While there is no evidence that frequent sexual intercourse is in itself as such harmful, aside that is from the indirect and in principle totally avoidable consequences of pregnancy and venereal disease, we legislate against this act at every level, both public and private. There is, on the other hand, clear evidence that firing bullets into people kills them. In America, however, no legislation exists against the purchasing and possession of firearms, or in this country against the possession of air rifles. In the light of the foregoing, are there not some grounds for suggesting that the attitude of Western society to sex is paranoid? So, I'm going to stop there because we're nearly at 1:30, and I think there's still quite a bit to go in this chapter. Actually, you know what? There isn't. I'm just going to... No, there isn't. I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to just plough through. Give me 2 minutes. What of the shallowness of felt and expressed emotion described by Henry Miller at the head of this chapter and so much in evidence around us? Shallowness of emotional response is, one recalls, a feature of the personality of the hospitalized psychopath. He is not only incapable of deep emotion, but of sustained emotion over any length of time. Thus, he has no real or abiding interest, no convictions, no passion, and no remorse. When he hits an old woman over the head and takes her money, it is with no intention of being cruel to her or of an actual, except perhaps momentary, wish to hurt her. This man is not so much unemotional as unemotional. Such is the way also of the news services, particularly of newspapers. There remains still a very important feature of clinical psychosis which we have so far neglected. This is the moment of onset of true madness, the point at which the patient loses his perception of real reality and can no longer distinguish between it and the products of his fantasy, his compulsions and malfunctioning nervous system. Anyone who saw either of the two films, Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove or Polanski's Repulsion, will have seen instances of this moment portrayed. In the first film, it is when the general suddenly begins to speak of the precious bodily fluids that one abruptly realizes that he has become clinically mad. In Polanski's film, we are shown the increasing oddness of the heroine's behaviour, a tendency to isolation and the breaking off of social relations, which remains, however, within the range of the normal. Then the point where a workman opens the girl's handbag and we see that it contains the decaying head of a rabbit. At this moment, we realise that the balance of the personality has tipped over into madness. It is such incidents as these, usually perhaps less dramatic, though by no means always, which the clinician looks out for in his interviews with those referred to him, the indicators of the loss of touch with reality. Such a moment appears to have occurred in respect of a whole society at the end of the last war. Right, so take a big pinch of salt. When the world saw for the first time what had taken place in the Nazi concentration camps, was there not evidence here that a whole nation had moved over the line into insanity? The majority of Germans, as might be the case with a psychotic patient, have been least able to accept this view. In general, we all were and are reluctant to admit that such events could occur in our species on such a scale. Hence, although the evidence is actually incontrovertible, the world has taken refuge in the notion that Nazi Germany constituted a special and self-contained case which could in no way be applied to mankind or society at large. I would like to propose that Lake Erie constitutes a second example of the phenomenon, nor is it by any means the only candidate for that position. If this is indeed so, then matters have reached a point where it is becoming too late to remedy them. In speaking of society and not individuals, however, we must beware of the possibilities of mystification. Society is not an actual thing or object which can exist in the absence of human beings. It is a collection of human beings and only a collection of human beings. The launching of the study, known as sociology, in relative isolation from the study of the individual, has aided the process of reification, the belief that there is such a thing as society. To be accurate, the boot is probably on the other foot. It is rather the impetus towards reification which has produced, amongst other things, sociology. Thus, when one here speaks of a psychotic society, one means one of two things, and only one of two things, there being no third mystical possibility, namely, 1, that a majority of the individuals who make up a community have become psychotic, and 2, that not the majority, but only the controlling minority has become psychotic. That is, those individuals who control the decision-making machinery, the means of production, or whatever. Both the cases specified could apply to our present society. In neutral terms, what appears to be happening is that the behavioural norm of Western society is moving along the ascending growth curve away from an acceptable state of System A normality towards clinical psychosis. The statement by the psychiatrists at the head of this chapter, together with those of many others, appear to bear this out. To close this section, one further word in connection with the study of psychology. The reason why the author attaches such importance to this branch of activity, apart from the fact that he is himself a psychologist, lies in the circumstance that in the study we have the best chance to see how our society regards life and the value and meaning it places on it. The social sciences in general are par excellence the showcase of our own view of ourselves. The example which follows here is drawn from a book already quoted at several points in these pages, Ian Oswald's book on sleep. Ian Oswald is also a psychologist, a well-qualified and successful one. That I have already quoted from the work in question is, hopefully, some evidence of my generally non-partisan attitude to this at once learned and useful book. One could have drawn something very like what follows from almost any psychological text in publication at the present time. There is therefore no question of selecting this book as anything other than a wholly typical example of what is widespread throughout the whole profession. The two following passages are taken from widely separated points of the text as indicated. So this is two quotes from Ian Oswald's book Sleep. There are unfortunately people who conduct hysterical campaigns bolstered by misleading, sentimental stories which evade the basic issues in order to further the cause of anti-vivisection, as they call it. These people who remain blind to the millions suffering from disease and who forget the other millions who are today alive and healthy instead of dead or sick, thanks to the advances of medical knowledge in the last 30 years, penicillin and anti-diphtheria inoculations, for example, try to prevent all experiments, no matter how simple, which involve animals. They speak of torture of animals by scientists, even when referring, for instance, to small and harmless injections. Of course it hurts to have an injection, but it is not torture. In fact, the poor, dumb animals upon which developing medical science depends often delight in the extra attention they receive through experiments. Unless they are happy, they are not healthy. Only healthy animals are used for experiments. And the second quote, the presence of two alternating kinds of sleep, clearly analogous to what is seen in the human, has now been discovered in numerous animal species, so that one can reasonably argue that experiments upon cat paradoxical sleep are relevant to human sleep with rapid eye movements. At Lyon, Jouvet made cuts through the brainstem, separating the lower part wholly from the upper part, or even removing the latter completely, including the cerebral cortex. What might be called the rear brain cat still went on alternating between two kinds of sleep, as far as could be judged by the appearance and disappearance of muscle tension and other bodily signs. Whenever the muscle tension vanished, as in the paradoxical sleep of the intact animal, a strong electrical shock was applied to the leg. Muscle tension returned and the animal appeared to be awake for a few minutes. In fact, it was possible to deprive selectively the rear-brained animal of paradoxical sleep. One could not possibly attribute dreaming to a rear-brained cat, so one could not say this particular form of meat was dream deprived. Only a physiological explanation is possible. A number of the comments one would like to make on these extracts would border on the libelous. These must therefore be left to the imagination of the reader. One can legitimately ask, however, whether Ian Oswald is not guilty of a certain amount of doublethink. Or could one accept that the cat in the second extract delighted in the extra attention it received during the experiment? One would hope so, because only a happy animal is of use to the experimenter. Of very considerable interest in these extracts is the immediately obvious and absolute denial of the unconscious, a very common feature in the literature of academic and experimental psychology. The experimenter here is clearly totally unprepared to admit that any form of consciousness or awareness could be associated with the lower or extracerebral centers of the brain. Only a physiological explanation is possible. In Chapter 6, it was suggested that one explanation for the insomnia suffered by clinical psychotics and pre-psychotics might be the desire to escape from the dreaming and the unconscious. The precise wording of the italicized sentence in the second extract quoted above gives particular cause for concern. This was the sentence, so one could not say that this particular form of meat was dream deprived. To myself, such statements are decisive links in the chain of evidence for the reality of the Psychotic Society as defined by this chapter. This aside, one must ask oneself, in all non-sentimentality, whether it is likely that any good for humanity can come out of any area of study, i.e. from experimental psychology, in which such attitudes are fundamental. So yeah, that is the end of that chapter. It gets a bit you can see Stan's a man of he's a man of good conscience. You know, he always owned cats. He's always kind to animals and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, he's a very good man in that way, in lots of ways. But he's right. There is just a general sort of negation of the unconscious, and that's what he was attempting to do, was try and sort of bring some of it back into our lives, and that's what this first book's really about. So it's not really focused on the hybrid stuff as much. It's just focused on the two sides of the mind and why one side is completely neglected. And it was because he was obviously a trained psychologist and worked as a child psychologist for years. So to him, it probably just seemed completely insane at the time, as you can tell from this chapter, is that he's obviously got like a bit of a bee in his bonnet about it. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 13. And because it's now 20 to 10, we're all going to go and go to bed and have an early night, I think, aren't we? All of us. Yeah. Okay, good. So I'm going to do the outro, and my mouse isn't working. What's going on? And say goodbye to everybody. So thanks for coming along and listening. And we're nearly there. I mean, we're sort of we're on like the last section of the book now. Art Morale. We've done the rise to tyranny of Western consciousness, And the next section is part 6, evolutionary prospects, the 3-dimensional personality. So this is towards the, an evolutionary personality. Okay, so I'm going to transition into the next scene. So I'll see you all next week, or see you on Telegram or something, Twitter or something like that, where I argue with people, or just put stupid shit up. Okay, so see you there. Thank you very much again, everyone, and goodbye.